Welcome back to the show. So, there's a noise going around in a segment of the Warcraft community, the idea that Mythic raiding is actually dying. This is a tone that's been around, and it's one that's very much amplified with the disbandment of Big Dumb Gaming Guild, which were one of the fairly well-known top-end Mythic guilds, as well as a few others. Now, even with that, I suspect that to many of you watching today, that's maybe a noise you haven't heard, because the reality is, most people do not play Mythic. I mean, why sweat about the problems of the 1%, or even the 1% of the 1%, the likes of Echo and Limit? But of course the thing is, if what works for them is barely working for them, and also for the top 200, and it's even worse for people who are not in the top 200, and loads of people are just writing the thing off, then that really is quite a problem for the game. Now, today's video was written by myself and also Dakor, who really led a lot of it. He is our resident cutting-edge Mythic raider. He's been doing that absolutely for years, and, well, he's also had his guild disband. You've probably seen a number of YouTube videos pop up around this idea as well, often from pretty top-end people. As for me, well, I'm firmly a rung down on that ladder. You know, heroic. I get ahead of the curve, and that's kind of the goal ticked off for a season. But even with that, I, and a lot of people like me, are feeling somewhat lost right now. You see, Aberrus and Emir Drasil Heroic, they're genuinely too easy for my raid team. But of course for us, Mythic is totally closed off. We're happy with our group of friends. We don't really want to invest the extra time and effort into getting 10 people while also somehow still preserving the social circle that we enjoy, so Mythic 20 is just not feasible. So, we are in a position where normal and heroic raiding is more accessible than ever, but for many old heroic raiders, the game is just no longer tuned for them, no longer tuned for us. But the next rung up in the ladder itself is struggling majorly. That's happening in 4 big areas, and that's what we're going to break down today. Tuning, design, progression, and barriers. We went deep, we've spent days reading, learning, listening, and that's only possible because of today's sponsor. Squarespace, they're an online site builder with a host of tools to support your needs, be they a portfolio, online shop, or your email newsletter. Their award-winning templates are so easy to understand, and their tools make it a breeze to customize your site. And recently, their Fluid Engine and Blueprint features have made all of that even better. Fluid Engine lets you granularly place elements on your site, giving you far more customization while still keeping it easy to use, and Blueprint walks you through creating your own template, selecting site elements, style, fonts, colors, and ensuring that it's all nice and harmonious, so even with no design experience, anyone can make something cohesive, that's content forward, and that works across desktop, tablet, and mobile. Back when I had to put up a quick site for us doing job applications and want to host some info for our game, Squarespace is where I went immediately. Time is money, and they will get you something that looks great super fast. And the good news is that at squarespace.com/Bellular Gaming, you can sign up and you can build a website for free, and then, only when you're ready to send it live, you can use code Bellular Gaming to get 10% off an annual plan. This part of the story starts with Sepulchre of the First Ones, which was a truly wild time. Blizzard basically got things so wrong with difficulty and gear acquisition that the likes of Anduin and the Jailer became some of the most nerfed bosses in World of Warcraft's entire history. This is a situation that led to game director Ian Hazzikostas saying this: "We'd rather not have to nerf things 20 times for the rank 100, 1000, or 5000 guilds to be able to blaze that same trail afterwards." He was talking about those nerfs, and people thought that with him saying that, things would change. They have a little bit, but not that much. Yes, Tindral and Farak were not as bad, but they still required a lot of heavy nerfs. It's almost as if Mythic has got its true Race to World First difficulty, a mode for the top 200, and then, many nerfs later, the Mythic mode that most people are actually able to progress through. In an ideal world, these nerfs wouldn't be needed. Natural gear progression is the thing that ultimately is supposed to do that job, but in reality, it doesn't. What actually happens on the ground is that most guilds outside the very top end do rely on nerfs for progress. Yeah, they can run into a brick wall for countless hours before a nerf, but that isn't fun, and by this stage, they've been trained to expect the nerfs. Clearly then, Mythic difficulty is calibrated for the race, and the rest are just left waiting for nerfs. That is something that, especially with, say, Tindrell, many faced this time round. Of course, what these nerfs are, though, are goalposts moving, and that's also a problem. We have this race first, majority of the player base second kind of approach that to many robs the satisfaction of earning a kill. Nobody likes it when the goalposts move. The experience of a boss going from a brick wall to a face roll is quite invalidating to people's progress. Your past efforts matter less because the kill was tampered with, and the nerfs often require brand new strategies, which, again, invalidates your progress and your prior efforts. Relearning a fight 200 pulls in ain't fun. Then there's the flip side, the guilds who actually do progress. Well, the challenge that they just overcame is then reduced, and if those players are motivated by ranking, if they care about ranking, that feels quite awful, and ranking does matter because Blizzard does support an official leaderboard. This stuff doesn't feel good. WoW's problem then is that Mythic is caught between the difficulty demands of the race and the difficulty demands of the majority of its player base, and as a mode, it doesn't seem to be growing. It's a difficulty mode that ultimately feels like it's made to cater to an unofficial esport, and then later nerfed into a design that works for the top end of WoW's player base. Ultimately then, no matter what way you cut it, the situation with nerfs is not ideal, and it shouldn't continue. It does, though, lead me to our final point on tuning. Okay, this is a smaller problem, but if it's fixed, it could rather counterintuitively actually make things worse. Let me explain. There is a mild increase in difficulty from bosses 1 through to 6, and then a massive jump up to Smolderon and beyond. Now, many would say that a more smooth difficulty curve would be ideal, right? Something about boiling frogs. But the problem is, if you smoothed out that difficulty curve, you'd probably end up making some of the first 6 bosses, well, harder. And as we've just covered with tuning, that actually might extend some of these problems to even more guilds. Okay, we've talked about tuning, but that's not the only thing involved. Next, we gotta talk about design. Okay, design-wise, there's 2 major things I want to hit. Number 1, instant wipes. Number 2, private auras, because surprisingly, they haven't worked. First up, instant wipes. This is one of the larger problems in modern WoW. Instant wipes that are caused by a single player's slight mistake. Say, missing an interrupt ever so slightly, soaking an orb half a second too soon. Essentially, binary pass-fail mechanics where if one single person fails, the entire group goes down. Now, yes, 100% perfect play from everyone may be intended for the race. Is that best for the game, though? That's an interesting question, and it's one that we have an answer for directly from World of Warcraft's game director. This is what Ian had to say. When is it okay to wipe the raid instantly for a mistake? Honestly, the answer should be almost never, at least when it's more like a single person's Twitch reaction mistake of you fail if you do a mechanic incorrectly or whatever. Ian goes on to say, it's totally reasonable on Mythic to kill the player for making a mistake like that. But, he says, and this is the direct quote, to say the entire raid is over because someone was 1 yard out of position is not our aim. Okay, the point then is, killing a player, fine. Wiping the whole team, that is not their aim, and that's the words of WoW's game director, who himself comes from a high-end raiding background. If that is their aim, Yggdrasil has not met it. Yggdrasil launched with 9 such mechanics. It's a pretty cut and dry topic, as is our next one, private auras. Private auras were initially hailed as a solution to the weak aura problem, where weak auras would essentially automate very complex boss mechanics. And the idea here is that anything protected by a private aura just can't be read by an add-on, and that means that weak auras wouldn't be able to do things like auto-assign player positions, timers, rolls, or anything like that. The context here is a lot, but mostly Shadowlands for today's purposes. Especially in the Sepulchre of the First One's race, the weak auras got completely out of control. It had many mechanics that required excellent split-second reactive decision-making from multiple people at the same time, and if that didn't happen, there would be a wipe. Yeah, I think you can understand the source of some of the Ian quotes we've talked about so far in the video. Anyway, with such punishing mechanics, it's no wonder that weak auras became extremely important to top-end guilds. The intent then was for private auras to solve this, but in reality, it just hasn't worked. You see, in many cases, private auras were applied to mechanics that were essentially impossible to do without some form of workaround. For examples, we've got Neltharion bombs, Smolderon orbs, and Farak orbs. Now, yes, the private aura means that it's impossible for an add-on to automatically tell people what to do. But do you know what private auras don't do? They don't stop players replicating that by just manually forwarding the information to weak auras via macro, which negates all of the private aura work with a single key press. Now the problem is, those macros could be secret. They could be rather brittle. So if you're a top guild that has got a dedicated weak auras development team, this stuff is actually better than fine. It's literally a competitive advantage because you have the resources to do a good workaround and other people won't. Those guilds below that level are essentially left waiting for Echo and Liquid to share their solutions. And because this stuff tends to be very complex and very custom, it's rarely a smooth experience where guilds are ending up spending large portions of raid nights just configuring weak aura packs, which is not fun. Now yes, they could simply not do this and try to do the fight normally, but if the mechanic feels wholly unreasonable to do without a weak aura, then the weak aura will feel like your only option. And this is rather well put by Celiathan, who put together a big old write-up for Raider.io on this issue. Here's the quote: "When difficulty no longer comes from actively playing the game, but the juggling of third-party tools, something is amiss." That absolutely is the case. And for an example, for Dakor's guild, they would spend multiple hours on multiple bosses getting weak auras ready across 20 players. Now they raid for 2.5 hours a night, and that means that large portions of their raid time went into weak aura configurations. And it's at this point that I would remind you that World of Warcraft is a game and a hobby. Maybe this is not what it should be. So between binary, white mechanics that hinge on a single player's reaction time and the ongoing issue with weak auras, Mythic is quite simply not hitting its design goals as stated by the developers and as felt by the players. Meanwhile, we then have all of the tuning issues happening on top of that. This is pretty rough, and it's happening to players who, to even show up, have got to go through quite a few hurdles. Organization is a nightmare in three main ways: roster, comp, and time. Let's learn why. Starting with roster. Mythic has always had a fixed 20-man requirement, and that's inherently hard. If you look at other games like Final Fantasy XIV, we see that even in their hardest difficulties, they're moving away from large team sizes like that. So if your guild has only got a stable roster of between 10 to 15 players, you are simply out of luck. If that's your social circle and you would like to do hard content, World of Warcraft is not a game for you. You either recruit more people, which risks your social enjoyment and team cohesion, you abandon your guild to do mythic content somewhere else, or you give up and just stop at heroic mode. The problem with heroic, though, is that, as I'll note, it's not what it used to be. Razageth was a very satisfying kill for my own team. Sarkareth was easier, less satisfying. Farak was an absolute pushover, which is insane given he was the end of expansion boss. Yet, for a guild like mine, well, Farak Heroic is the end of the line. We're not going to split up. We don't want to recruit more people. And you might say, that's a you problem. And you're right, it is a me problem. But the thing is, if thousands of teams are in a similar position, then what in isolation is a me problem, well, that turns into a problem for WoW. On the other end of the scale, there is the problem of over-recruiting. If your attendance is close to 100%, which you would certainly hope for, then there will be people on the bench who just won't see any play and who wants to be stuck on the bench. Those people will eventually leave. 20 players is hard right now. WoW makes it even harder, and a key part of that is our next point, and that is composition. Just bring the player, not the class. Optimization only matters for race to world first guilds. That sounds like a reasonable thing to say, but it is missing context. It's implying the whole thing is a self-inflicted avoidable problem caused by sweaty race to world first players and the meta slaves who follow. The reality though is more like this. With how impactful raid buffs are nowadays, there's almost no choice left in group comp. In some of the popular standard comps, there's like 5 free slots. 15 are pretty much rigid. Now, why would somebody shoot themselves in the foot by using a suboptimal comp for months of raid progression, especially with all of the difficulty stemming from tuning and design that we've already covered in this video, with Blizzard literally needing to move the goalposts via nerfs to get guilds across the line. Now, this has the knock-on effect of gradually shrinking guild rosters as comps become more rigid. That has impacts on your bench, and that's of course built around class buffs and utility. Less diversity of classes will mean fewer opportunities for players to play what they enjoy. These smaller rosters with fixed feeling comps then means one big thing, and that is fragility. Fragility leads to frustration, it leads to inordinate pressure on players to actually turn up because rosters are getting smaller, and that leads to the dreaded thing of having to recruit people mid-tier, and this slowly kills guilds. It saps their energy. As Nascent recently shared in their community council thread, one that got a lot of traction, our roster has been forced to be so small that we often struggle to adapt because of how rigid we are being forced to operate. It is more difficult than ever to operate a Mythic raiding guild. That is not good, and it's a hell of a lot to stick out given our next thing, time commitment. If you're doing Mythic, then cutting edge is probably your goal. That's going to require between 2 and 4 days a week of maybe 4-hour-long play sessions across 2 to 4 months, right? At least 10 hours of raiding a week. But in addition to that, you're going to need as good gear as you can get. That means doing lots of Mythic Plus, especially front-loaded at the start of the season. So, over 10 hours a week of boss progress, then you've got your weekly keys, your pre-raid prep, your character prep, and then third-party tools like weak auras, cooldown spreadsheets, and various add-ons, which all is a lot of work. Essentially, this extracurricular work, on top of the already demanding raid schedule that many teams have got to set in order to actually hit their goals, it is simply a recipe for burnout. Guildmasters and officers are just not finding it sustainable, and this is a theme you will see if you read almost any guild disbandment blog post. Gear then. This doesn't seem to be as major, but the very rare items and no deterministic way to get them can lead to frustration. It's one of those things where, well, yeah, getting a big, exciting bit of loot is fun, but if you get it by the time a raid is on farm and there's not that much else to do, well, is that fun? Is that exciting? Do you feel like you can actually use that new piece of gear? To many then, rather than something fun at the end of their journey, these end up feeling like a bit of a frustration, something that they would rather have a bit earlier so that they could enjoy putting those bits of loot to work while they are progressing. A lot of people in the Mythic community also speak of the dinar system that was added in Shadowlands Season 4, but as we already know, Blizzard considered it to be a bit too fast when it came to giving people, well, those key bits of loot like weapons and trinkets. To me, in looking at the big picture, I think gearing is in a far better position, really, than it's been in years. However, for Mythic, they're trying to do the hardest stuff, so any issues will kind of be exacerbated. I think that's what's going on there. Also, on the topic of legendaries, well, I think suffice to say, Dragonflight legendary acquisition hasn't really gone down amazingly with the Mythic people either. I think on gearing there are problems, but they're not humongous ones. Some people would also say perhaps that the myth track stuff, you know, maybe a heroic raider shouldn't be able to get gear that is that good. I think there's a discussion around there, but overall to me it seems that gearing is a issue, but it's certainly not the biggest one. With that said, let's actually talk about solutions here. Solutions, and I think there's good news here where The solutions do seem rather clear. I mean, you can nudge class design to have fewer fixed slots within a comp. Maybe consider dinars or something inspired by them as a system in the game. I know Blizzard are a bit scared of that, but I think in a very alt-saturated landscape that I think is what the War Within is going to be, something like that could actually work. I'd also say consider maybe players having some control over that very rare loot. Maybe something cool could go on there. Then we've got the hard-to-stop design problems that have persisted from Sepulchre of the first ones through to now, even though interviews have acknowledged that those problems are problems and that the developers want to fix them. I think the solution there is pretty simple. Fix them. The developers said they know what the issue is, so I imagine that, well, can be done, right? That's all fine and clear. There is one larger structural change, however, that people are interested in, and that is Mythic 10. A 10-player version of Mythic. It's been talked about for a while recently, popping off on Twitter, Reddit, as well as YouTube content from some high-end players, and as well in dev interviews. Many people want it, and personally, I am one of them. Admittedly, though, it totally is in my interests. I mean, Heroic, as I said, is simply too easy for my guild, but we don't want to expand and take on the organizational work that would come with Mythic 20 rating. So for us, Mythic 10 means we get a perfect step up. We don't have to radically change how our guild is organized. It would be fantastic. Yet, you can still see that there could be some problems. A tightly designed encounter for 20 players, you can't just half that and expect it to work just fine for 10. Certainly fights like, say, back in the day, the council fight that was quite a bit harder in 10-player than 25 with the initial launch tuning of Throne of Thunder. That's one that I've got launch month memories of. So yes, you've got some design quibbles there. Even things like loot item level. I mean, would Mythic 10 in fact be a middle ground between Heroic and Mythic 20? And Mythic 10 would be nice, but would it inherently fix some of the problem issues that we've had here? No, it wouldn't. If you still have those, one player makes a whoopsie, the whole raid explodes, if you still have those problems that the Mythic population is, that they're all thrilled about, well, Mythic 10 will certainly increase the Mythic population, but those problems may still persist. Blizzard seem to have been a bit more dismissive of the idea of Mythic 10. To be honest, though, I think it's probably time to give it a shot. I do think there's a clear option. You've got the likes of a Season 4 of an expansion. That would have been, obviously it's too late now, but that would have been a almost perfect time to do something like Mythic 10 as an experiment. Although, my mind does go to, say, Wrath of the Lich King. It also goes to the Siege of Orgrimmar, both periods of time where World of Warcraft experimented with the format of its raids during an expansion. If they said, hey, for the first raid tier of the War Within, we're going to try Mythic 10. It'll have slightly worse gear than Mythic 20. We're going to give it a shot and see if it works. What would my response be to that? It would be pretty simple. Yeah, I'd acknowledge there could be issues, and it may not all go perfectly, or maybe even for some completely unforeseen reason, it could be a total disaster. But I would respect the effort, and I'd be down for the experimentation, because I think, if anything, that willingness to experiment and play just a little bit more fast and loose with things, I think that has yielded good results in terms of the core game design of World of Warcraft through Dragonflight, and I'm very keen to see how that team is able to make the game better through to the future, and hopefully the narrative side follows, but that's a little bit out of scope for today's video. Anyway, that's the discussion. I'd love to know what you think. If you're maybe somebody like me who is not finding the heroic rating as maybe as satisfying as it was when you were, say, killing Razageth, because man, that was a satisfying kill compared to Farak, but you don't want to do Mythic, like, would you be interested in Mythic 10? I think actually, if you would be, we should really get together and tell Blizzard. Who knows, maybe there's some people at Blizzard that are just absolutely, dying to give Mythic 10 a shot, and maybe they'd feel a little bit better if they knew the community kind of had their back. Anyway, that's it for me. I hope you found this to be an interesting exploration of the issue. Thanks for watching, and I will see you again soon.